Inklings students, it's Miss Katie. I wanted to make a video for you guys this week, bringing together some of the ideas we've been talking about the last couple of weeks about Tolkien's poem Mythopoeia. I think this poem is really important to understand, and it's a great bridge between some of Lewis's ideas as a young man that we've been talking about in Surprised by Joy, and some of the ideas that Tolkien helped share with him later on, and that became central to the entire group of the Inklings. So it's got some great ideas. It's got some really interesting ways of thinking about our faith and about creativity and storytelling that I think I'd really love for you guys to walk away from this class with. So I wanted to do this for you guys and kind of hit all those ideas. Maybe some of you will want to touch on this in your final project as well. So I hope this helps. But let's go back to the beginning of the poem and a little bit of context. The poem's called Mythopoeia, and that actually means myth maker, or myth making. And it is addressed, it's written by Tolkien, 1931, and it's addressed from a philomythos, which means lover of myth, to misomythos, or hater of myth. Now, this poem was one that Tolkien wrote directly after a conversation between himself, C.S. Lewis, and Hugo Dyson. And remember, all three of these guys are in the Inklings Society. And they were having this conversation about Christianity, mythology, and truth. And C.S. Lewis made this comment that myths are lies breathed through silver. In other words, myths are beautiful lies. Now, if you've been in this class and you've been listening and participating in our conversations on Lewis's essay, which he wrote later, called Myth Became Fact, you might be like, what? That doesn't sound like something C.S. Lewis would say. And it is absolutely the opposite of what later C.S. Lewis would say. But young C.S. Lewis, as a young man, a young professor, an intellectual, and something of a materialist for some amount of time, did not believe that about myths. He did not believe that myths carried truth. He was sort of jaded about them. Remember when he was a young man and Surprised by Joy, myths were one of the things that sparked that sense of sin-soaked, that joy-filled longing that we've been talking about. But as he grew older, as he became more academic and less imaginative, perhaps, they kind of lost that spark for him. But he still studied them. He still thought they were beautiful. And in fact, mythology is one of the main reasons why Lewis and Tolkien became friends. So as you think about that, I want you to think about how God works in our lives. And that in the case of C.S. Lewis in particular, God used his love of story and the friendships around him to lead him to Christ, and then in turn think about all of the wonderful things that Lewis's writings, all the wonderful impact that his writings have had on the world and continue to have. So it's pretty amazing to think about how God used that love of story that he had from a young age and the friendships he was surrounded with to bring him to Christ. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so that's the context. So after this conversation, Tolkien responded to Lewis that he was wrong, that myths did carry truth, even if they carried it imperfectly, which is an argument we'll see Lewis use later. But that Tolkien believed that we, as fallen human beings, are sub-creators, that we create because we're made in the image of a maker who is creative and who creates. And that when we're seeking after truth, that the stories and the art that we create will reflect that, even if it reflects it imperfectly. So to further explain this, he went home and crafted a 7-page poem called Mythopoeia, and then he sent it to C.S. Lewis. So that was very important to understand about the poem. And next, I'm just going to go over some of the main ideas that we see in this work that are important to the Inklings and central to their legacy, really, as we read this poem. Okay, so I will dive in and pull out a couple sections of the poem here shortly. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's quite long and because I think you've all read it at least once already, either in class or at home. But I do hope that after you watch this video, that you'll go back and look at it on your own in more detail and look for some of these ideas that I'm talking about, because a lot of the ideas in this poem are reflective of the legacy of the Inklings, of the way that they told their stories and the way that they have shaped the lives of so many over the last several generations. They've really shaped a lot of the ways that we think about faith and Christianity, I think in a good way, and in a really beautiful way. So here are some ideas that are central to the Inklings that we have been talking about, that we will continue to talk about in class, and which might be good topics for your final project as well. So the first thing I want you to look for as we go through this poem is the contrast between materialism and romanticism, particularly baptized romanticism. Don't worry, I'm going to talk about what that means. So when you say materialism, I want you to think about matter, a physical matter in science, and that will help you remember what that means, because materialism basically asserts that the only things that matter are made of matter, are the things that we can see and we can touch, and that nothing else is real. The imagination, the spiritual world, none of that, it doesn't really matter to us. It's not directly impacting us. All that matters is matter. And this is something that the more works of the Inklings you read, the more you'll see how detestable they found this idea. That life is all about economy and function, climbing the social ladder to no purpose. Nothing has any eternal meaning. It's all just regulated and mechanical, kind of. So we see that in Tolkien's, I think about when Saruman cuts down the trees to his own kind of selfish ends. I think about in Magician's Nephew in the Chronicles of Narnia, when Lewis is writing about the creation of Narnia, and it's so beautiful and there's so much wonder in the natural world. But then Uncle Andrew, all he can focus on is, if I could plant some steel in the ground here, I bet a train would grow out of it, because they're putting in all these things and these beautiful trees are growing out. But anyway, so materialism is the focus on the material things, basically. And romanticism is where, remember the Romantics, we've talked about the Romantics. There's this emphasis on the imagination and the natural world, the beauty of nature, and the imagination, emotion, and wonder, and how these things have purpose and they have value, and that they can convey deeper truths about the world than just the material world can convey. So the Inklings were all Romantics when they were all in their writing circle together, and they practiced, I guess, what we sometimes call a baptized romanticism, that not only does imagination matter, but that God can speak to us through imagination, through story, through art, that God can speak to us through those things, through our senses, and can speak to us through our emotions. So not to say that every time we have an emotion that it's from God, or that every piece of art is from God, but that God can speak through those things, just as he can speak through truth and reason. So we see this contrast between materialism and romanticism in pretty much every work of all of the Inklings, especially Lewis and Tolkien. So if you've read Narnia, I bet you can find some examples just by thinking through that. The other thing I want you to look for is the idea that imagination and language are gifts from God. So we see this, excuse me, that kind of has to do with the romanticism point, but we see this in this poem, and language in particular was also important to all the Inklings, especially Tolkien and Owen Barfield. But Tolkien, remember, was a philologist, and he did a lot of deep dives into the origin of words and to what it had to say about man. And I think that God really spoke to him through his love of languages and through his development of languages. But just for us as non-philologists, we've talked about this in class as well. It's important for us to remember that language is something that we have in the image of our Maker, that God God created the world through the spoken word, and that we also have the ability and desire to create with words, to create stories. And so that's something that we can definitely take away. The other thing I want you to look for is the word and the idea of a sub-creator. I think he does actually use the word sub-creator in the poem. But a sub-creator means an under-creator. So that, like I was just saying, we create because we were made in the image of one who creates. So that there is meaning and purpose in our desire to be creative and our desire to use our imaginations to create fantastical worlds or art or music and beautiful things, that these reflect our creator. So that's a very important point, very central to all the Inklings, and sub-creator was a term used specifically by Tolkien. And then lastly, I think I want you to look for the idea of redemption. And throughout this poem, there are lots of nods to the fact that we as human beings do reflect some truth and do reflect our creator within our limited capacity, that we're fallen and that we get many things wrong and we don't often understand the whole. But at the end of the poem, there's this acknowledgement that one day in eternity, all will be revealed and everything will be redeemed. Again, another idea we've talked about, that redemption doesn't just cover man and sin, but the universe. And so that includes in this poem the creative arts as well. So when you think about eternity, when you think about paradise, I want you to not think about people floating around in nightgowns playing harps, but the picture that Tolkien paints of this is a place where our pursuits and our creative acts and everything that we do will have such a great meaning that there's no way we can comprehend it right now. And that so redemption is to serve in this greater purpose that we can't even understand. And so all of these things are in the poem. I also want you to pay attention, we talked about this in class, to places where certain words are capitalized. And in this poem, I think for the most part, if not always, the capitalization is a reference to God, is a different name of God. So there's one place where he says the white light, and white is capitalized. At one point, wise, the wise is capitalized. So in those places, that's a direct reference to God. And then one more thing, in this poem, the rhythm has something to say as well. And I didn't get into this in class, but it's very interesting. I thought you guys might appreciate it. So the rhythm and rhyme scheme that Tolkien used in writing this poem is known as heroic couplets. That's 2 lines at a time that rhyme with each other. And then he also used iambic pentameter throughout. And some of you are familiar with iambic pentameter from Shakespeare. It's where you have the 10 syllables, you have an unstressed, stressed pattern. So it's like ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Anyway, you have to be very intentional when writing in iambic pentameter and also in obviously having rhyming couplets. So there's a reason Tolkien used this form. It has a very metrical, logical, reasonable sound to it when read aloud. And remember what I say, you have to read poetry aloud because the sound has something to say as well as just the words. Tolkien modeled this style of poetry after a poet, Alexander Pope, who wrote during the Enlightenment and who used very logical, reasonable arguments. And so Tolkien is arguing with those who think that imagination and wonder are pointless, who are all about being rational and being logical and being materialistic. He's arguing with them on their own terms by using a rhythm and rhyme scheme that would have been appropriate to that kind of argument. So it's very smart. I didn't want you guys to miss that because it just kind of gives us another glimpse at how brilliant Tolkien was with language and also at his sense of humor. But I hope that you guys will be able to read this poem with those things in mind. And we're going to look at just a couple examples really quick. Okay, so let's pull out a couple of these ideas really quickly. This is the opening of the poem, and I want you to look for his depiction of kind of that materialistic mindset that we talked about. sort of this cold, calculated approach to everything, that everything's mechanical, that everything's made for no reason and will go to die for no reason. There's no point to any of it. It's very fatalist. And this would have been the worldview of a lot of people at this time. Remember, this is in the years in between World War One and World War II. So there'd been a lot of death and despair. Let me open you up with this here. You look at trees and label them just so, for trees are trees, and growing is to grow. You walk the earth and tread with solemn pace, one of the many minor globes of space. A star's a star, some matter in a ball, compelled to courses mathematical, amid the regimented cold inane, where destined atoms are each moment slain. So he's talking to the hater of myth. And when we say myth, I want you to think about imagination and wonder and those things. So the person who turns away from all that is walking the world with solemn pace and sees everything, even something as beautiful and as glorious and mysterious as the stars, as just some matter in a ball, compelled to courses that are mathematical, that are able to be calculated. It's a very cold, very regimented view of the world. And then later on, I'm just going to touch on this line. He continues to kind of describe things. He calls it as slime crawling up from mud to live and die. And then he goes on to say, yet trees are not trees until so named and seen, and never were so named till those had been, whose speech's involuted breath unfurled, faint echo and dim picture of the world. So he's getting at something a little bit here about that we have this idea of what trees are, but who named them the trees in the first place? Who identified them and called them what they are? So in getting at our human capacity to name things, he's getting at our nature as creative beings and beings of language, and that'll come in more later. A little nod to his philology here, a couple stanzas down. He sees no stars who does not see them first, of living silver made that sudden burst, to flame like flowers beneath an ancient song, whose very echo after music long has since pursued. There is no firmament, only a void, unless a jeweled tint, myth-woven and elf-patterned, and no earth, unless a mother's womb, whence all have birth. So, a lot of things happening here, but I love his description of stars in this passage, especially compared to the description of his stars in the opening, which was some matter in a ball compelled to courses mathematical. That would be the materialist view of stars. But this is more the romantic view that we see here, that stars are living silver, made that sudden burst to flame like flowers beneath an ancient song. So this is the view that the myth maker has when he looks at the stars. And I think he's arguing here too also that that is the way that we all look at stars when we're children. We have that wonder. I also love the inclusion of elf patterned in here, because in the Bible, whenever we see El, like Elohim, it's pointing to divinity, to angels often, and Tolkien worked this into his own development of Elvish. His elves are people of the stars. So I just thought that was cool. That ties into some medieval cosmology stuff as well. So he's kind of tying his own mythology in here by referencing elves in conjunction with stars. So just a little Tolkien wink there. And then this part we talked about in class. I'm just skipping, I'm going in order, but I'm just kind of skipping over some things. This is the beginning of the next stanza. The heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise, and still recalls him. Though now long estranged, man is not wholly lost, nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship one he owned. His world dominion by creative act, not his to worship the great artifact. Man, sub-creator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues and endlessly combined, in living shapes that move from mind to mind. I think this is like the key part to understanding this poem. And there are a few things in here. The heart of man is not compound of lies. We draw some wisdom from the only wise. So wise there is capitalized. The only wise is our creator, is God. So yes, we do have some lies, but we still draw wisdom from the only wise. And then later, it says that we're disgraced, but not dethroned. God gave us dominion of the world, and he made us in his image. And even though we are fallen and sinful creatures now, we still have that role that he gave us. And he kind of describes this by saying that we wear the rags of lordship. So think about a king that's been in disgrace, that has his original robes, but they're torn and worn out. That's kind of like us. And then I love this part. Man, sub-creator, the refracted light through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues. So I want you to think about what happens when you have light streaming through the window and you hang a crystal with lots of facets in the window to catch that light, and it comes out in different colors. It refracts the light. Tolkien is comparing us to that, that we can reflect light and we can't grasp it fully. We can't take in the full spectrum of light, but we can grab pieces and reflect pieces of it. And he's saying that we do that in the things that we create. And here again, just like wise, a single white is capitalized. So pure white light would be the light of God. And light in literature and in poetry is often used side by side with truth. So we see that here. Tolkien saying that we can take in the truth and we can't understand it or reflect it fully, but we can still reflect aspects of it. That's a really important part here. So go ahead and read the rest, and then I just want to touch at the end about paradise. He says, "In paradise perchance the eye may stray from gazing upon everlasting day, to see the day illumined and renewed from mirrored truth, the likeness of the true. Then looking on the blessed land, 'twill see that all is as it is, and yet made free. Salvation changes not, nor yet destroys garden nor gardener, children nor their toys. Evil it will not see, for evil lies not in God's picture, but in crooked eyes. Not in the source, but in malicious choice. Not in the sound, but in the tuneless voice. In paradise they look no more awry, and though they make anew, they make no lie. Be sure they still will make, not being dead, and poets shall have flames upon your head." We'll talk about that in a second. "And harps whereupon their faultless fingers fall, there each shall choose forever from the all." So he's painting a picture of heaven here. And he's saying that in eternity, in paradise, we will still create. We will still have work to do, but that it will not be refracted, that we'll be able to accept and understand the truth and paint a fuller picture. I would put it like this: now we can only draw with broken crayons and limited experience and understanding of principles of art. But in heaven, we would be able to draw with the understanding of a master with limitless supplies. I like that line, "There each shall choose forever from the all," and all is capitalized. So, and then the poets shall have flames upon their head. That's not saying all the poets will be caught on fire. That's a reference to the Holy Spirit, so that the poets will be full of the truth of the Holy Spirit. So he's saying we still have work to do in paradise and eternity, and that everything will be redeemed, which gets back to that idea I mentioned earlier, that redemption is for everything. I hope that this helps. Reach out with any questions. I really hope that this will lead you to go look at the poem again in this kind of new light. And I will see you guys in class.